On a cold Saturday afternoon in March 1911, the sky above Lower Manhattan darkened, not with storm clouds, but with smoke. It rose from the upper floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a modern building meant to symbolize progress. Inside, flames raced through fabric and paper. Doors were locked, stairwells filled with heat. Young women, mostly immigrants, many still teenagers, pressed against windows that offered no escape. From the street on Washington Place, a woman stood frozen. She heard the screams first. Then she saw bodies fall, one after another. Black shapes against the pale sky, hitting the pavement with a sound no one there would ever forget. Fire ladders came up short, safety nets tore apart. In less than 20 minutes, 146 workers were dead. The woman watching was not a firefighter. She was not a politician. She had no power to stop what was happening. Her name was Frances Perkins. Years later, she would say that everything she believed about government, responsibility, and human dignity could be traced back to that afternoon. Not because she was inside the factory, but because she stood outside, helpless, forced to see what happens when an industrial nation values profit more than people. This is not a story about heroics in the moment. There were no dramatic rescues, no speeches shouted into the smoke. There was only witnessing, and the quiet, irreversible decision that came after. Frances Perkins did not turn away. She watched until the fire burned itself out. She watched as the bodies were covered. And somewhere between the sirens fading and the crowd dispersing, a promise was made. One not written down, not spoken aloud, but carried forward for decades. A promise that suffering like this should not be the price of making a living. A promise that government could be more than distant law. It could be a shield. So tonight, as we begin this story, let us ask a simple question, one that still echoes through American life today. What if the American safety net began with a promise made in fire? If stories like this matter to you, quiet stories that shaped the world without shouting, consider subscribing to the channel. Like the video, leave a comment, and tell us, where do you think real change truly begins? Chapter 1. A reserved childhood, a radical conscience. Frances Perkins did not come from noise. She was born in 1880 in Boston and raised in the measured, disciplined world of New England, where voices were kept low, emotions controlled, and duty ranked above desire. Her parents were conservative in temperament and deeply shaped by Protestant ethics. Work was expected. Self-restraint was praised. Moral seriousness was assumed, not debated. As a child, she was known as Fanny, a softer name, suited to the expectations placed on young women at the turn of the century. But even early on, there was something slightly misaligned between the name and the mind behind it. She was observant, inward-looking, more comfortable with books than with performance. She did not rebel loudly. She absorbed. In her teenage years, she made a small but telling decision. She would no longer be called Fanny. She chose Frances instead. It was not a dramatic act, but it was a deliberate one. The new name carried weight. It sounded formal, restrained, professional, closer to how she wished to move through the world. Frances Perkins would later become known for enormous institutional change, but this early act revealed her method: quiet self-definition, enforced by discipline rather than confrontation. Education sharpened what temperament had already prepared. At Mount Holyoke College, one of the few institutions that took women's intellect seriously, Perkins encountered a demanding moral environment. Academic rigor was paired with a sense of social obligation. Students were taught that learning was not an ornament, it was a responsibility. Knowledge implied service. The Protestant ethic of her childhood did not fade here, it intensified. But it also evolved. Faith was no longer only about personal righteousness. It began to gesture outward, toward society, toward systems, toward collective obligation. At Mount Holyoke, Perkins studied chemistry, physics, economics, and history. She learned how institutions functioned, how decisions cascaded through communities, how order could be imposed or withheld. Just as importantly, she learned restraint. Public emotion was discouraged. Precision was valued. Change, if it came, was expected to come through preparation. She did not yet imagine herself reshaping a nation. There was no grand ambition forming, no clear political identity taking shape. What emerged instead was something quieter and more durable. A conscience trained to think structurally, and a personality comfortable operating without applause. Frances Perkins left Mount Holyoke not as a radical in appearance, but as something more unusual for her time. A woman who believed that moral duty could and should be organized. She was still reserved, still careful, still patient. But the foundations had been laid.
Chapter 2. Seeing Poverty Up Close. Frances Perkins arrived in Chicago with ideas that were orderly, well-intentioned, and incomplete. Like many young, reform-minded graduates of her era, she believed that poverty could be understood from a distance, measured through reports, explained through lectures, addressed through carefully designed programs. It was a belief shaped by classrooms and sermons, by theory more than touch. Hull House changed that. Founded by Jane Addams, Hull House sat in the middle of Chicago's industrial neighborhoods, surrounded by tenements, factories, and rail yards. It was not a charity in the traditional sense. It was an experiment in proximity. Those who wished to help were expected to live among those they served. Perkins did. Here, poverty was no longer abstract. It had an accent. It had tired hands. It spoke in languages she did not yet understand. Immigrant families crowded into dark apartments. Women stitched garments late into the night, not for ambition, but for survival. Children moved through the streets with an alertness that came from knowing how easily one could be forgotten. Perkins listened more than she spoke. That, too, was her habit. She observed how work followed people home, how wages failed to cover rent, how illness could erase a family's future in a matter of weeks. These were not moral failures. They were structural ones, patterns repeated too consistently to be blamed on character. What unsettled her most was not the existence of hardship, but its predictability. At Hull House, reform was no longer a matter of persuasion alone. It became a matter of presence. Perkins learned that data without empathy produced distance, and empathy without structure produced exhaustion. The people around her did not need to be saved. They needed systems that did not abandon them. Women bore the heaviest weight. Many worked for less than subsistence wages, then returned home to unpaid labor that never ended. Children learned early that childhood was negotiable. Safety, rest, and education were privileges, unevenly distributed, easily withdrawn. This was the gap Perkins could no longer ignore. The difference between what reformers believed society to be and what it actually demanded of its most vulnerable. She did not leave Hull House with slogans. She left with a recalibrated understanding of responsibility.
Change, she realized, would not come from sympathy alone. It would require endurance, institutional thinking, and a willingness to stay close to the people, to the conditions, and to the uncomfortable truths that polite society preferred to keep at a distance. This was not yet a call to power. It was an awakening through proximity, and it would shape everything that followed.
Chapter 3. The Fire That Changed Everything.
On March 25, 1911, New York City moved at its usual Saturday pace. Shops prepared to close early. Streets filled with shoppers and workers eager for a brief rest. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, occupying the upper floors of the Ash Building near Washington Square, was nearing the end of its workday. Shortly before 5 o'clock, fire broke out. It began quietly. An ember, a spark, something small enough to be ignored. But inside the factory, fabric scraps and paper patterns fed the flames with terrifying speed. Smoke thickened. Heat rose. Workers rushed for exits that were locked, stairwells that filled with fire, elevators that stopped coming. From Washington Place below, Frances Perkins watched. She had been having tea nearby when the sound drew her toward the square. At first, she could not understand what she was seeing. Then the windows filled with figures. Young women pressed together, faces pale, dresses already darkening with smoke. The screams came next. Fire ladders stretched upward but fell short by several floors. Safety nets were raised and ripped apart under the force of falling bodies. One by one, workers chose the only escape left to them. They stepped into open air. Perkins stood among the crowd, unable to move. She did not avert her eyes. She watched bodies strike the pavement. She watched firefighters weep in frustration. She watched the fire consume what had been presented as a modern, efficient workplace. In less than half an hour, it was over. 146 people were dead, mostly immigrant women, many no older than Perkins herself. Their names would later be printed in newspapers, often misspelled, sometimes shortened, sometimes lost entirely. Perkins was not inside the factory. She was not injured. She would never claim the older of a survivor. Her role that day was simpler and heavier. She witnessed. In the days that followed, the city returned to motion. Funerals passed through the streets. Investigations were promised. Condolences were offered. Yet even as public grief surged, Perkins felt something quieter taking hold. An understanding that memory alone would not protect the living. This was not an accident, she understood. It was the logical outcome of indifference made routine. Years later, she would describe that day as the moment her life's direction became fixed. Not because it revealed evil, but because it revealed how easily suffering could be normalized when responsibility was diffuse and power unaccountable. She did not speak grandly about it at the time. There were no public declarations, no recorded speeches beneath the smoke-darkened sky. But privately, a vow settled into place. Clear, uncompromising, and enduring. I came to Washington to work for God, FDR, and the millions forgotten. The words would come later. The meaning was older there. The fire did not turn Frances Perkins into a crusader. It did something more enduring. It stripped away the comfort of distance. From that day forward, she would measure progress not by intention, but by consequence, by whether the vulnerable were safer than they had been before. She had looked directly at catastrophe and refused to explain it away. And having seen it, she could not unsee it. Chapter 4. Learning the Machinery of Power. Grief alone does not change systems. After the Triangle Fire, New York was briefly united in outrage. Newspapers demanded accountability. Crowds filled memorial halls. But Frances Perkins understood that public emotion, however intense, was temporary. If anything lasting were to emerge, it would have to be built into the machinery of government itself. That machinery was neither elegant nor welcoming. In the months that followed, New York State created the Factory Investigating Commission to examine labor conditions across the state. It was an unprecedented effort, broad in scope, technical in detail, and politically dangerous. Perkins was brought in not as a figurehead, but as a working member, tasked with investigating factories, drafting findings, and translating human suffering into language the law could recognize. She entered a world of hearings, transcripts, and statistics. Factories were inspected, testimony was taken. Employers explained locked doors as necessary precautions. Lawyers debated definitions while conditions remained unchanged. Perkins learned quickly that moral clarity did not automatically produce political action. Facts had to be framed, language had to be precise, and every reform, no matter how modest, required negotiation. This was where her temperament proved decisive. She did not raise her voice. She did not posture. Instead, she mastered process. She learned how to draft legislation that could survive committee review, how to anticipate objections before they were spoken, how to concede on the peripheral in order to secure the essential. Compromise, she discovered, was not surrender. It was strategy. Perkins also learned the limits of outrage. Legislators could be persuaded by numbers more readily than by tears. Employers responded to standards when they were enforced consistently, not when they were framed as moral appeals. Even reformers, she noted, often disagreed more fiercely with one another than with their opponents. What emerged from the commission was not a single sweeping solution, but a series of structural changes. Fire safety requirements, exit regulations, occupancy limits, inspection protocols. None of them dramatic on their own. Together, they altered the daily reality of work. For Perkins, this period marked a critical evolution. She did not abandon her moral convictions. She disciplined them. She came to understand that ethical intent without institutional design produced little more than frustration. Reform required scaffolding, rules, enforcement mechanisms, budgets, and authority. It was here, in conference rooms rather than on street corners, that Perkins began to see the true shape of power. It did not reside only in elected office. It lived in committees, in draft language, in the quiet decisions about what would be mandatory and what would remain optional. This was not the work of inspiration. It was the work of construction. By the time the commission concluded its investigations, Frances Perkins had acquired something rare among reformers: a working knowledge of how to move the state, not just persuade it. She had learned the machinery of power and how to make it turn. Chapter 5. The Unlikely Alliance: Perkins and Roosevelt. Frances Perkins did not seek powerful allies. By the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt became governor of New York in 1929, Perkins was already known within reform circles as a serious administrator, precise, tireless, and unsentimental about process. She had little interest in personality-driven politics. What mattered to her were outcomes and the willingness to sustain them. Roosevelt was a different kind of figure. He was charismatic where Perkins was reserved, instinctive where she was methodical. He understood people, moods, and momentum. Perkins understood systems, constraints, and consequences. Their temperaments did not naturally align, and that was precisely why the partnership worked. As governor, Roosevelt faced mounting economic pressure even before the full collapse of the Great Depression. Labor unrest, unemployment, and public anxiety demanded action. He needed advisors who could move beyond rhetoric. Perkins was one of them. She did not flatter Roosevelt, nor did she defer easily. In meetings, she spoke plainly, often with a stack of data at hand. She framed problems not as moral crises alone, but as failures of structure that the state could correct, if it chose to commit. Their relationship was not built on admiration. It was built on negotiation. Perkins understood Roosevelt's political instincts and used them carefully. When she proposed reforms, workplace safety measures, unemployment relief, minimum standards, she did not ask whether he supported them in principle. She asked whether he was willing to stake authority on them. Support, she believed, meant enforcement. At one critical meeting, she presented Roosevelt with a list of reforms she considered non-negotiable. If he wanted her continued service, these were the terms. It was an unusual posture, especially for a woman in a male-dominated political environment. But Perkins was not auditioning for favor. She was setting boundaries. Roosevelt listened. He did not always agree, and he rarely committed immediately. But he recognized in Perkins something he valued deeply: competence without ego. She could design policy and absorb criticism without demanding credit. That made her indispensable. Their alliance deepened not through speeches, but through results. New York became a testing ground for labor protections and relief programs that balanced political feasibility with moral urgency. Perkins helped translate Roosevelt's broad impulses into durable administrative action. Over time, trust formed. Roosevelt came to rely on Perkins not as an ideologue, but as a stabilizing force, a voice that could tell him what would work, what would fail, and what compromises would cost too much in the long run. For Perkins, the alliance was never personal. It was instrumental. She did not follow Roosevelt because she believed in him. She worked with him because he was willing, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes boldly, to move the levers of power in the direction she believed necessary. Together, they were not equals in visibility, but they were partners in effect. And as the nation edged toward deeper crisis, that partnership would soon be tested on a far larger stage. Chapter 6. The First Woman in the Cabinet. In March 1933, as the United States stood on the edge of economic collapse, Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced his cabinet. Among the familiar names of senators, businessmen, and party loyalists, one appointment landed with particular force. Frances Perkins would become Secretary of Labor. She was the first woman to hold a cabinet position in American history. The reaction was immediate and uneven. Newspapers noted her gender before her qualifications. Editorial cartoons exaggerated her appearance. Commentators speculated about temperament, endurance, and whether a woman could command authority over labor disputes, unions, and industrial leaders during a national emergency. Perkins understood the stakes. Visibility, she knew, was a form of exposure. Every mistake would be magnified. Every mistake would be magnified. Every decision would be read not as personal, but symbolic. She would not be allowed the luxury of failure that men in similar positions often took for granted. So she made a choice that confounded expectations. She did not dress to provoke attention. She did not perform authority. Her clothes were plain, her manner restrained, her voice measured. She cultivated an image of seriousness, not because she lacked confidence, but because she understood the political cost of standing out in the wrong way. This was not modesty born of insecurity. It was strategy. Inside the Department of Labor, Perkins moved quickly. She organized teams, clarified chains of command, and insisted on procedural discipline. Outside, she avoided spectacle. She rarely sought headlines. When praised, she deflected. When criticized, she absorbed it without retaliation. In Congress, skepticism ran deep. Some legislators questioned whether her appointment was a concession to symbolism rather than competence. Others waited for missteps. Perkins responded not with argument, but with preparation. She arrived at hearings with facts, drafts, and enforcement plans. Over time, resistance softened, not into admiration, but into acceptance. That was enough. Perkins understood that survival was a prerequisite for influence. If she could remain in office, she could work. If she could work, change could follow. The public, too, adjusted. Slowly, the novelty faded. What remained was a figure who did not resemble traditional power, yet exercised it effectively. She did not seek to redefine leadership in words. She redefined it through endurance. To be the first was to be vulnerable. Perkins never forgot that. She limited what the public could misinterpret. She narrowed the space for attack. And in doing so, she secured the room she needed to operate.
Chapter 7. The Great Depression's Human Cost. By 1933, the Great Depression was no longer an economic abstraction. It was a daily presence, visible in every American city and countless rural towns. Factories stood silent. Farms failed. Banks closed their doors. Men who had worked all their lives found themselves idle, their skills suddenly without value. For Frances Perkins, the crisis was not defined by statistics alone, though the numbers were staggering. Nearly 1 in 4 workers was unemployed. Breadlines stretched for blocks. Families rationed hope as carefully as food. What troubled her most was not only the scale of suffering, but its erosion of dignity. At the Department of Labor, reports arrived in steady waves. Accounts of men riding freight trains in search of work, women selling household possessions to buy bread, children leaving school to supplement family income. This was not misfortune caused by individual failure. It was systemic collapse. Perkins saw the Depression as a national moral test. In her view, a society revealed its values most clearly in moments of widespread vulnerability. Temporary relief, soup kitchens, emergency work programs, charitable donations could ease pain, but they could not restore stability. They treated symptoms, not causes. Without structural support, families hovered perpetually on the edge of disaster. Relief, she believed, was necessary, but it was not sufficient. The prevailing assumption of the era was that economic downturns corrected themselves and that personal resilience would carry people through. Perkins rejected this logic. She had seen how quickly illness, injury, or unemployment could dismantle even the most disciplined life. The Depression simply made visible what had always been true. Security was fragile, and the risks of modern industrial life were unevenly distributed. She framed unemployment not as a personal shame, but as a shared condition, one that demanded collective response. Hunger, she argued, was not a lesson in thrift. It was a failure of planning. Inside government, this perspective was not universally welcomed. Some feared dependency. Others warned of overreach. Perkins listened, but she did not yield on the central point. A nation that relied solely on emergency charity had already accepted instability as normal. She asked harder questions. What happened to workers when age ended their employability? What protected families when a wage earner disappeared? How long could democracy endure when insecurity was permanent? These were not rhetorical exercises. They were warnings. Perkins understood that economic collapse did more than empty pockets. It corroded trust between citizens and institutions, between effort and reward. Without a reliable foundation, people turned inward or against one another. Fear became political. In this sense, the Great Depression was not only a financial crisis, it was a crisis of faith in systems, in fairness, and in the future. For Perkins, the answer could not be a series of temporary rescues. It had to be something enduring, predictable, and impersonal enough to outlast moods and administrations. The human cost of the Depression demanded more than compassion. It demanded structure. Chapter 8: Inventing the Safety Net. The idea did not arrive fully formed. There was no single meeting, no dramatic announcement, no moment when a new national system was unveiled with certainty. What emerged instead was a growing recognition, shared by Frances Perkins and a small circle of policymakers, that modern America had outgrown its assumptions about risk. Industrial life had changed the terms of survival. Old age, unemployment, disability. These were no longer rare misfortunes. They were predictable outcomes in a volatile economy. And predictability, Perkins believed, demanded preparation. Inside the Roosevelt administration, this realization carried political danger. The word security itself was contested. To some, it suggested stability. To others, intrusion. Critics warned that any permanent system of income protection would undermine self-reliance. Supporters countered that a nation built on wage labor owed its workers protection when wages disappeared. In 1934, Roosevelt asked Perkins to chair a new body, the Committee on Economic Security. The appointment was deliberate. Perkins was not chosen for her rhetoric, but for her discipline. The committee's task was not to inspire the public, but to design something that could withstand scrutiny from economists, lawmakers, business leaders, and an increasingly anxious electorate. She assembled a group that reflected that mandate: actuaries, legal scholars, labor experts, administrators. Their meetings were technical, often dry, and quietly consequential. Charts replaced slogans. Long-term projections replaced moral appeals. At the center of it all sat Perkins, steady and insistent. She framed the committee's work around a simple premise: insecurity was not a personal flaw. It was a condition of modern economic life. The question was not whether government should respond, but how responsibly it could do so. Resistance came quickly.
Newspapers and political opponents asked the same question again and again. Is this socialism? Would Americans accept compulsory contributions? Would the federal government become too powerful? Would the system collapse under its own weight? Perkins did not dismiss these fears. She addressed them methodically. She emphasized that what was being considered was not charity, but insurance. Workers would contribute. Benefits would be earned. The system would be structured to be self-sustaining, not discretionary. Its purpose was not to equalize outcomes, but to stabilize lives. Still, tensions ran high. Within the committee, disagreements surfaced over scope, eligibility, and administration. Outside it, critics warned of unintended consequences. Perkins listened, adjusted, and recalculated. She was willing to narrow proposals if it meant securing their survival. What she refused to abandon was the core idea, that security should not depend on luck alone. The work was slow by design. Every assumption was tested, every projection challenged.
Perkins understood that a fragile system, however well-intentioned, would do more harm than good. This was invention without spectacle. No banners, no speeches, just the careful construction of a framework that could absorb shocks, economic, political, and human. By the time the committee concluded its work, nothing had yet become law. There were no guarantees of success, only a blueprint shaped by caution, compromise, and a quiet conviction that the nation could choose stability over perpetual crisis. The safety net had been imagined. Whether it would be accepted was another question entirely. Chapter 9. The Social Security Act. When the Social Security Act reached Congress in 1935, it arrived not as a promise of perfection, but as a test of what the nation was willing to accept. Its structure was deliberate and restrained. At its core were two pillars. The first addressed old age, pensions designed to provide a basic income to workers who had reached the end of their earning years. The second addressed instability, unemployment insurance, meant to soften the shock of job loss in a volatile economy. Together, they represented a quiet redefinition of responsibility. Risk would be shared, not shouldered alone. For Frances Perkins, the architecture mattered as much as the intent. Benefits were tied to contributions. Payments would be predictable, not discretionary. Administration would be systematic, insulated, so far as possible, from political mood. This was not charity. It was insurance, built to endure beyond the crisis that had given it urgency. Debate was fierce. Supporters spoke of dignity and foresight. Opponents warned of dependency and federal overreach. Some argued the act went too far, others that it did not go far enough. Perkins watched these arguments with practiced restraint. She knew that the survival of the system depended less on ideal outcomes than on political viability, and viability demanded compromise. To secure passage, entire categories of workers were excluded: agricultural laborers, domestic workers. Many of them were poor. Many of them were black, concentrated in the segregated South, where political resistance to federal labor standards was strongest. The exclusions were not accidents. They were concessions, painful, calculated, and deeply consequential. Perkins understood the cost. She had long believed that economic insecurity did not discriminate, even if policy often did. But she also recognized the constraints of her moment. A broader bill, she feared, would fail entirely. A narrower one, however flawed, might establish a foundation that could later be expanded. This was the moral tension at the heart of the act. The Social Security Act offered protection and revealed who was deemed protectable. It acknowledged vulnerability while reproducing inequality. It built permanence while leaving millions outside its shelter. Perkins did not celebrate these omissions. She recorded them. She spoke of them with regret, but she did not abandon the project. In her view, legislation was not a final statement of justice. It was a foothold. When President Roosevelt signed the act into law in August 1935, there was no eruption of public joy. The benefits would not arrive immediately. Payroll taxes would begin before payments did. The system would take years to mature. Yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time, the federal government accepted ongoing responsibility for the economic security of its citizens. Not in moments of emergency alone, but across the span of ordinary life. Old age would no longer be treated as a private failure. Unemployment would no longer be dismissed as moral weakness. The act did not eliminate fear. It organized it. For Perkins, the moment was not triumphant. It was sobering. She knew the law would be criticized, from the right for what it attempted, from the left for what it omitted. She knew that its exclusions would shape lives for generations. And she knew that the work was unfinished. But she also knew this: a system now existed where none had before. A framework had been established, capable of amendment, expansion, and correction. History would judge the Social Security Act not only by its intentions, but by its consequences. Frances Perkins accepted that judgment in advance. She had built what her time would allow, and left the rest to those who came after. Chapter 10. Enemies on all sides. Once the Social Security Act became law, opposition, it intensified. From the business community, criticism was blunt and relentless. Employers objected to payroll taxes, regulatory oversight, and what they saw as an expanding federal presence in the workplace. Trade associations warned that mandated contributions would stifle growth. Editorials predicted economic stagnation. Lawsuits followed, challenging the constitutionality of the new system. To many industrial leaders, Frances Perkins had crossed a line. She was portrayed as an architect of intrusion, a bureaucrat who misunderstood enterprise, a reformer indifferent to profit. Perkins did not respond publicly. She understood that argument would only elevate the noise. Instead, she focused on implementation, trusting that a functioning system would speak more persuasively than rhetoric. But pressure did not come from one direction alone. On the left, disappointment curdled into resentment. Labor activists and progressive reformers criticized the exclusions embedded in the law. They pointed to agricultural and domestic workers left unprotected, to benefits that would take years to materialize, to a system they believed moved too cautiously in the face of mass suffering. To them, Perkins had compromised too much. She listened to these critiques with a different kind of discomfort. They echoed concerns she herself had raised behind closed doors. But in public, she defended the act as a beginning rather than an endpoint, an imperfect structure that could be expanded only if it survived. This position left her politically exposed. Within the Roosevelt administration, Perkins was respected but rarely embraced. She lacked a personal faction. She did not cultivate loyalty through favors or spectacle. Her authority came from competence, not charisma. In an environment increasingly defined by ideological battles, this made her solitary. Congressional support was conditional. Business leaders distrusted her. Activists
doubted her resolve. Newspapers alternated between suspicion and fatigue. Perkins felt the isolation acutely, yet she did not retreat. She continued to enforce labor standards, defend the department's authority, and protect the integrity of the systems she had helped design. She accepted that leadership in this moment meant standing between irreconcilable demands, absorbing criticism without the relief of belonging. Enemies on all sides were not a sign of failure, she believed. They were evidence that the work had mattered. In private, she acknowledged the cost. There were moments of exhaustion, flashes of doubt, and the quiet awareness that she would never be fully forgiven by either camp. But she measured success differently. If the system endured, criticism would eventually lose its edge. For Frances Perkins, political isolation was not a tragedy. It was a condition of doing work that altered foundations rather than surfaces.
She remained at her post, steady, uncelebrated, and increasingly alone, holding together a structure that few loved, but millions would come to rely upon. Chapter 11. The Shadow of McCarthyism. By the late 1930s, the political climate in Washington had hardened. Economic fear had begun to give way to ideological suspicion. The language of reform was increasingly recast as the language of subversion. Programs once debated on their merits were now examined for hidden loyalties. And Frances Perkins, long associated with labor protections and social insurance, found herself standing beneath a new and colder light. Accusations surfaced quietly at first. Critics began to suggest that the ideas she had helped advance bore the fingerprints of radicalism. Social security, they claimed, resembled European collectivism. Labor standards, they warned, weakened American independence. The word communist was rarely defined, but it was deployed with purpose. Perkins understood the danger immediately. In 1939, the House Un-American Activities Committee turned its attention toward the Department of Labor, focusing on immigration decisions made under Perkins's authority. A particular case, an accused communist whose deportation she had delayed on legal grounds, became the pretext for broader attack. She was summoned before Congress. The hearings were tense, but restrained. There were no theatrical confrontations, no raised voices, no dramatic revelations. Instead, Perkins faced pointed questions framed to imply negligence, sympathy, or worse. Her critics searched for evidence of ideological alignment where there was only administrative process. Perkins responded with calm precision. She did not defend herself emotionally. She did not appeal to her record or invoke her years of service. Instead, she explained procedure, due process, statutory authority, legal obligation. She treated the accusations not as personal affronts, but as misunderstandings of governance. This was deliberate. To dramatize the moment, she believed, would be to legitimize it. Perkins understood that panic fed on performance. Silence, by contrast, denied it oxygen. Privately, the strain was considerable. She was exhausted. Her isolation deepened. Even allies hesitated to speak too loudly in her defense, wary of association. The accusation itself had become corrosive, proof unnecessary once suspicion took hold. Yet the case against her collapsed. No evidence of disloyalty emerged. No ideological conspiracy was uncovered. What remained was a portrait of a public servant who had followed the law in an era increasingly hostile to nuance. Perkins was not vindicated with ceremony. The hearings simply ended, and attention moved elsewhere. But the experience marked her. It confirmed what she had long suspected, that systems built to protect could themselves become instruments of fear.
She did not respond by retreating from public life, nor did she harden into defiance. She continued as she always had, measured, procedural, unadorned. In the shadow of McCarthyism, Frances Perkins chose steadiness over spectacle.
She trusted that history would distinguish between conviction and accusation, between reform and ideology. And she remained committed to the work, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. Chapter 12. A woman who never sought the spotlight. Frances Perkins guarded her private life with the same discipline she brought to public service. In an era when women in power were scrutinized as curiosities, she offered little for public consumption. She did not cultivate intimacy with the press. She rarely spoke about herself. What attention she could not avoid, she narrowed carefully, keeping the boundaries of her personal world intact. Her marriage reflected that restraint. In 1913, she married Paul Caldwell Wilson, an economist with progressive views and a temperament far more fragile than her own. Over time, his mental health deteriorated, leaving Perkins as the primary stabilizing force in their household. She managed medical care, finances, and the quiet labor of protection, shielding both her husband and her daughter from public exposure. This responsibility was not episodic, it was constant. While Perkins attended hearings, drafted legislation, and navigated political hostility, she also arranged treatment, oversaw schooling, and maintained a home life defined by vigilance. The strain was cumulative. There were no accommodations for family burden, no recognition of emotional labor. The expectation was endurance. She rarely spoke of the cost. To do so, she believed, would invite doubt about her capacity to serve. Vulnerability for a woman in authority risked being read as weakness. And so Perkins carried the weight quietly, absorbing exhaustion, postponing grief, compartmentalizing her life with almost clinical precision. Her choices were shaped by necessity rather than ambition. She did not seek admiration. She sought effectiveness. Public recognition offered no relief from private responsibility, and so she declined it whenever possible. There were sacrifices she accepted without complaint. Friendships narrowed. Leisure disappeared. Moments of solitude became rare. Yet she did not frame her life as one of deprivation. She understood her work as obligation, not self-expression. The price of public service was not only political attack or professional isolation. It was the slow erosion of personal space, the persistent awareness that one role could never be fully set aside for another. Frances Perkins lived at that intersection, between duty to family and duty to country, without romanticizing either. She did not ask to be remembered as a trailblazer or even as an architect of reform. She asked only that the work endure. In choosing the spotlight sparingly, she preserved the steadiness that made the work possible. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy shaped not by self-display, but by sustained, often unseen, commitment. Chapter 13. Leaving office, leaving a system behind. In 1945, as the Second World War drew to a close, Frances Perkins quietly stepped out of government. There were no farewell speeches filled with praise, no grand ceremonies marking the end of her tenure. After 12 years as Secretary of Labour, the longest in the nation's history, her departure was procedural, almost understated. The world had moved on to new crises, new leaders, new fears. Perkins did not object to the silence. She had entered public office to build systems, not to occupy attention. And by the time she left, one such system had taken root, so thoroughly that many Americans no longer remembered a time without it.
Social Security was no longer an experiment. Payroll taxes were being collected. Benefits were being distributed. Unemployment insurance had become a stabilizing force in an uncertain economy. The idea that the federal government bore responsibility for old age and job loss, once radical, had settled into expectation. This, to Perkins, was success. She understood that permanence was the true measure of reform. A policy that survived only its architects was fragile. A policy that outlived them became infrastructure. As she cleared her office, the political landscape looked different from the one she had entered in 1933. The urgency of the Depression had been replaced by post-war confidence. New debates emerged over the scope of government, the limits of regulation, and the meaning of security in a changing world. Yet the foundations remained. Millions of Americans now planned their futures with an assumption that had not existed a generation earlier: that old age would not mean destitution, that job loss would not necessarily mean collapse. These expectations were modest. They were also transformative. Perkins did not linger to defend her work. She did not frame it as legacy. She understood that systems were strongest when they became ordinary, when they faded into the background of daily life. Her departure was marked by continuity rather than rupture. Others would administer Social Security. Others would amend it, challenge it, expand it. Perkins accepted this without anxiety. Control, she believed, was less important than durability. She left office having done what she had set out to do, not to solve every problem, but to change the terms under which problems were faced. The system remained, and that, for Frances Perkins, was enough.
Chapter 14. Was it enough? Time has a way of clarifying what urgency obscures. From the vantage point of the present, the achievements of the New Deal and Frances Perkins's role within it invite both gratitude and critique. Social Security remains a cornerstone of American life, yet its original form reveals the compromises and exclusions of its era. What once seemed expansive now appears incomplete. Modern critics ask necessary questions. Why were so many workers left out at the beginning? Why did racial and gender inequities persist within a system designed to provide security? Why did the New Deal stop where it did? These questions are not indictments of intent. They are reminders of constraint. The New Deal was not a revolution. It was a negotiation between fear and stability, between innovation and tradition, between federal authority and local power. Its limits reflected political realities as much as moral hesitation. Southern resistance, business opposition, constitutional uncertainty, all shaped what could pass and what could not. Frances Perkins understood those limits better than most. She did not claim to have built a just society. She claimed only to have constructed a framework capable of growth. In her view, the danger was not imperfection, but paralysis. A partial system that endured could be expanded. A perfect one that failed would leave nothing behind. This perspective has not always aged comfortably. To some, Perkins appears overly cautious. To others, pragmatic to a fault. Yet this tension is inseparable from the work itself. Structural change rarely arrives whole. It arrives in segments, layered, contested, revised. Perkins positioned herself as a builder of foundations, not a finisher of edifices. She accepted that later generations would judge her choices, revise her work, and point out what she could not or did not achieve. She believed that such judgment was a sign of democratic health, not failure. The question, then, is not whether the New Deal was enough. It is whether it made more possible. Measured this way, Perkins's legacy rests not in completeness,
but in direction. She helped turn the nation toward the idea that economic security was a public concern, one worthy of structure, permanence, and debate. What followed was never meant to be final. It was meant to continue.
Chapter 15. The Measure of a Life. In her later years, Frances Perkins receded almost entirely from public view. She continued to teach, to write, to speak occasionally about government and responsibility, but without urgency or self-importance. The work that had defined her life no longer required her presence. The systems she had helped build were operating on their own, imperfect, contested, but alive. This distance did not trouble her. Perkins had never measured success by recognition. She measured it by continuity. To build something that required constant defense, she believed, was to build something unfinished. Endurance was the quieter test. As she aged, the world around her changed again. New movements challenged old assumptions. New crises exposed old vulnerabilities. Social security was expanded, amended, criticized, and defended, often without reference to its origins. Perkins watched these debates not as an owner, but as a custodian who had already passed on the keys. She did not insist on credit. When asked about her legacy, she resisted summary. Lives, she believed, were not meant to be reduced to achievements. The temptation to narrate one's own importance was a distraction from responsibility itself. What mattered to her was simpler. Had suffering been reduced? Had risk been shared more fairly? Had the future become slightly less precarious for those who came after? These were questions without final answers. Frances Perkins died in 1965, at the age of 85. There were no national days of mourning. No monuments rose immediately in her name. The absence did not negate her impact. It confirmed her method. She had built in ways that did not require remembrance. The measure of her life was not found in titles held or barriers broken, though both were considerable. It was found in the quiet persistence of a system that continued to function long after her voice fell silent. Millions of people aged, lost jobs, recovered, and endured, without knowing her name. And that, perhaps, was the truest legacy of all. To build something that outlives you is to accept anonymity in exchange for durability. Frances Perkins accepted that bargain. Epilogue. Every check is a whisper of her name. Today, Social Security rarely feels like history. It arrives quietly through a direct deposit, a monthly check, a line item in a household budget. It is discussed in policy debates, defended in election cycles, criticized for its costs, and measured in spreadsheets. For most Americans, it is simply there, unremarkable, expected, woven into the rhythm of modern life. That ordinariness is its triumph. When older Americans pay rent, buy groceries, or afford medicine because of Social Security, they are not participating in an abstract program. They are living within a system designed to make survival less fragile. Millions of lives have been steadied not by charity, but by structure. Frances Perkins does not stand in bronze outside government buildings. There are few grand memorials bearing her name. Her face is not printed on currency. History did not reward her with spectacle. Instead, it absorbed her work. She built something meant to disappear into daily life, something durable enough to function without gratitude and strong enough to endure political storms. That was always her intention. She believed that the highest form of public service was the kind that made itself invisible. Every month, when a check is issued or a deposit clears, it carries no signature from her hand. Yet it carries the echo of her decisions, the insistence that risk be shared, that old age not be punished, that a modern society accept responsibility for its own stability. The beneficiaries rarely know her story. They do not need to. Systems are the final language of values, and in the quiet persistence of Social Security, Frances Perkins continues to speak. So as this story ends, we are left not with a monument, but with a living legacy, one that touches millions of lives every single day. Some architects build with stone, others build with laws. Frances Perkins built with compassion and the courage to make it permanent. If you value stories like this, stories of quiet power, moral endurance, and the systems that shape our lives, consider subscribing to the channel. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us, what unseen structures do you rely on every day?